Welcome to the Hey Docs podcast with your host, Jill Allen. Today I have special guest Greg Drysdale from WaterPointe Consulting joining me on the show. Greg is an expert in data privacy and security, and today he'll be sharing insights on the importance of these practices in dental and orthodontic offices. We'll explore common pitfalls, how to improve data privacy, and the role of WaterPointe Consulting in helping practices stay compliant. There's a lot to learn, so let's get into it. Hey, docs. When it comes to marketing, I keep hearing that you're frustrated and that you don't know what you're paying for or even if your marketing efforts are working. Are you wondering what your next marketing move should be? I would suggest you contact Mary Kay Miller and her team at Kaleidoscope. With their free digital marketing audit, you will get answers and solutions to your biggest marketing questions. Go to contactkl.com to request your free digital marketing audit today. When it comes to websites, SEO, and digital advertising, you don't know what you don't know till you know. Find out what you don't know today. That's contactkl.com. All right, Greg, I am so excited to have you on Hey Docs. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yes, absolutely. So the way I love to start off Hey Docs is to have my guests just tell our audience a little bit about who you are, a little bit about your company, WaterPointe Consulting, and just what you're doing in our industry.
Sure. WaterPointe Consulting is a healthcare and consumer data privacy company. So what we do is we help businesses gain and maintain compliance with various data privacy laws. Those can include things like HIPAA, state healthcare laws, state consumer laws, global consumer laws. And really what we do this to ensure that the personal data that these businesses are collecting is protected and only disclosed as the various laws will allow. And by doing so, then we can help practices like your audience build trust to attract and retain patients. So we believe that strong data privacy practices can be a real differentiator for a practice. As far as myself, my background is in technology. So things like data and software development. I'm a former corporate vice president for a pretty well-known company. I'm also retired from the Air Force. The last 7-8 years, I've been really digging in and trying to learn the best ways to build and manage good data privacy programs. And then last year I decided I don't want to work on the corporate side anymore. So I left and tried to start this business up, partnering with my wife on it. She spent a lot of time in healthcare. So a lot of time in hospitals and medical practices in very HIPAA heavy roles. Mm-hmm. And so really she has a lot of that additional practical knowledge. Hey, what can we do? What should we do here? That I think our combined knowledge and certifications, backgrounds makes us very unique in the market.
Yeah, I love that. And gosh, I was very excited to have you on today because this is one of those, I'm going to say just feels like a gray area, even though I know there's a lot of black and white in this area. It's, I like to say, the unsexy side of our business when we own businesses, and especially in the healthcare realm where there's a lot of, like you said, just data privacy that we have to be aware of. And I think especially in the orthodontic industry, as we are continuing to move where everything is digital. We don't just have lockdown files in our office, and most of the data that's going back and forth is going up to a cloud and whatnot. So I love that you're in this space. I love that we're going to have a great conversation today. And I just know that our young docs are going to get a lot out of this, which is, I think the more information we can arm ourselves with, the better we can be at compliance, but also just knowing where some red flags may be that, or where we may be exposed in our businesses that we may not know. So with that being said, I'm wondering if we can just start super basic here. And when we hear about or think about data privacy or consumer data or the scary word HIPAA or all of those things, which in some ways means the same thing and in other ways don't mean the same thing at all. I'm wondering if you can just pretend like we don't know a whole lot here and break that down for us and tell us what those terms mean and what that means to us especially in our orthodontic realm that we live in.
Yeah. Sure. We start basics. So data privacy itself is really just the principle that a person should have control over their own data. And that includes how businesses handle that data. So from a patient or a consumer perspective, it's their ability to determine the where and the how and to what extent they share their personal data with others. And once they've shared that information, all data privacy laws contain certain rights to the individual over their data. These are things like right to access their data, right to correct, right to delete their data, right to know how their data is being shared with others, right?
Sure.
Um, and I think one of the keys here is a certain amount of trust is required for individuals to share their data with practices and other businesses. You have to have a good feeling about somebody that they're not going to do anything that's going to put your data at risk.
Sure.
And then from the practice side, once that individual decides that they trust the doctor or the practice enough to share their information, it's then the practice's responsibility to protect the privacy of that data through things like proper handling, processing, storage, disclosure. For your audience, the patient's in control, they have all these rights, and they expect a certain level of privacy and protection. And then
Mhm.
that practice is responsible for providing that. So that's really what we're talking about. And then you mentioned terms like consumer healthcare or consumer and healthcare data privacy. So really, there's not much of a difference there other than what laws apply and what rights are granted, right?
Mm.
So a lot of these different regulations all have the same kind of rights that they grant. For your audience of doctors, HIPAA almost certainly applies unless they're doing some things that's really old school, not doing any electronic processing and things like that. But then beyond that, depending on the state that their patients reside in, the type of data that's collected, some annual revenue thresholds, number of records processed, other state healthcare and consumer laws could also apply. So that the types of things that practices need to be concerned with are dependent on those types of factors. There's commonalities for sure, but it's rarely a one size fits all scenario.
Got it. Got it. Oh, I love that. And I'm going to imagine we know that all of this is very important. We have to have kind of these safeguards in place for the patient, of
Mhm.
course, but also just from the owner, I would assume, as a compliance piece. And I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit. I know I found it interesting that you said depending upon the state, are there
Mhm.
different things that we have to pay attention to depending upon the states that we're in,
Mhm.
or maybe the way that we are doing our data, how we're handling data, different things like that? Do you mind unpacking that just a
Yeah,
little
for sure.
for us?
Certainly. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, based on your location or really your patient or the consumer's location. That's really what controls most of these laws, right? And not specifically for HIPAA because HIPAA is a federal law, so it's going to apply to everybody within the United States. But then there's certain additional things that states add on to that, right? So there's these state healthcare privacy laws. And a lot of what that does is changes definitions of what data is considered that needs to be protected, how long you have to announce that there was a data breach. Things like that can change from the original HIPAA
Mhm.
requirements. And then even further on is these consumer laws. And we'll take Colorado since that's near and dear to your heart.
Yeah.
Colorado has a comprehensive consumer privacy law called CPA, and every resident of the state of Colorado has these rights that are granted. And again, we talked about some of them: right to access, right to delete, right to correct. But there's also certain things that the thresholds and things like that. So if a company's big enough and they have a certain amount of annual revenue, then these laws apply. If they're below that, they don't. A lot of just weird how many data records you collect within a year or process within a year. Those kind of things throw things out of balance a little bit. And that's why it's a little hard to keep up with some of these things, especially on the consumer side where there's not a federal law. Right now, it's all left to the states. And I think right now there's something like 8 or 9 states that have comprehensive privacy laws. And then there's another 6 or 7 that are coming online within the next year. So that'll continue to change. Again, most of those are relatively similar. And even right now, it may get a little better because the federal government is considering a federal bill on this. So there's all kinds of things that may change, but I guess the point here is that there's just a lot of variables and practices have to watch out for all of them. And it even you mentioned the data that you collect. And so For a practice, obviously they have their healthcare data set, and this is everything within probably their practice management system and
Yep.
everything that's related to that patient. Now, if they collect other things outside of that data, things like other personally identifiable information via maybe a contact form on their website, or they do things like sweepstakes or giveaways or their social media, that's not technically covered by HIPAA because if it's outside of their healthcare record, and those might be picked up under some of these other laws.
Very interesting. I would have never thought of that, and I'm sure a lot of doctors haven't, that there are still data privacy laws that are in effect potentially when we're out there saying, "Hey, give us your email address," or, "Hey, give
Mhm.
us this. We're doing this thing here or this thing there," which kind of makes me wonder, number one, if we don't know about it, how do we find out about what this looks like? But secondarily, what are the consequences if we are not doing a good job at following good data and consumer privacy practices? What does that impact look like to us? And I'm sure there's probably scales of this,
Mhm.
but can you talk to that a little
Sure.
bit?
So the answer to that is it really depends. It depends on the law, specific law. Some laws, if someone brings up a complaint to one of the boards, what'll generally happen is it'll get investigated. Some things can happen, like the company can get fined, the practice could get fined. They could be told they have to change the ways they're doing things. And then some states allow for citizens to actually sue and collect money directly. It's going to be all over the board. So it's hard to really lock that down. Now with HIPAA, there is no private right within HIPAA. So nobody's going to be getting sued. However, what happens is if someone brings something to the attention of Health and Human Services, whether that be via a breach or via some other violation of a HIPAA rule, then what's going to happen is HHS will generally come in and start digging in, and they have the right to levy fines and
Wow.
things like that.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious. Again, this is this scary gray area that all of us are like, I don't want to talk about it too loud because I don't want to get the privacy police looking my way. What does a company like yours, WaterPointe Consulting, do that kind of helps keep doctors safe? Are you getting in there ahead of time and just evaluating what practices they have in place and helping them see their weak points? Or are you coming in more after the fact when they have maybe gotten themselves into got the eye on them and they're like, "Oh, shoot, now what?"
No, so generally what companies like mine would do is we would come in before and we would help them write their processes and make sure that everything's in place. So data privacy consultants generally know the laws and the best practices around privacy and security. And they use that knowledge to put the necessary things in place to keep the patient data protected as best they can. So generally that's some kind of combination of three things, right? It's an audit, right? So come in and examine current practices, processes, procedures, security controls, even the website, to really understand the risk level and build a plan for any future improvements. So I can't speak for everybody. For us, that basically looks like 2 days on site and another week or so to do any additional research, develop a scorecard and plan. But once that plan's delivered, then the second piece of that after audit is build, right? So based on whatever comes out of that audit, we're going to build out all the required documentation, the processes, the procedures, policies. We're going to advise on cybersecurity practices, advise on necessary website changes, build out an incident response plan. And so this is right, like all the meat. And this generally, it's a lot of documentation and it's a lot of figuring out what processes should look like. Generally, still only a couple weeks worth of work. Um, and then once that's all done, audit's been done, bill's been done, then it's really about training the staff, right? So it's building a practice specific training plan, building a document repository to house all these artifacts we've created, and then actually coming on site for another day. And this is our process, but coming on site for another day and to train the staff on the process and procedures and policies. Again, this takes about a week for that whole phase, including the day on site. The whole process is fairly straightforward, able to be completed in about 4 weeks with pretty minimal disruption to the practice. I always say, I think there's a general misconception with these types of services that it takes a long time or it is extremely disruptive or expensive. That definitely isn't the case, especially when you're talking about small to mid-sized practices. When you get up into, if you're consulting for DSOs or those or med groups or hospitals, obviously that timeline and cost and all that kind of stuff changes a bit.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, for a practice, that's basically what it looks like. And then you had mentioned, do you come in after the fact? That depends. That depends on a few things. Like, we are going to build out the incident response plan. So what happens if something goes wrong? What are the steps you take to do whatever you need to do to remedy that, right?
Yeah.
But it also depends on either in-house or contracted IT. A lot of those folks have these types of services too, and they're probably even a little better equipped. They have a lot of the tools that they're going to be able to really dive in and figure out how it happened and all this kind of stuff. We can help guide and control the overall process, but then there's some more technical aspects to it. But so that's generally what it looks like. It's a combination of audit, build, and train.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Audit, build, and train. So, with that being said, a lot of my listeners are brand new doctors. They are just getting started, just opening up their practices. I've got to guess that there's a little bit of a difference on what a startup doctor who maybe is just getting going. I got maybe one employee and myself. I'm
Yep.
just getting my doors open to that existing practice that has been going for a while. We got a full team. We're rocking and rolling. We're 5, 8, 10 years in.
Sure.
Is Can you talk about the differences there, if there are many, or things that a doctor in one stage of their practice life may be thinking about versus a doctor in a different stage?
Sure. So I would say, generally speaking, the end goal and the things to be considered are going to be the same, right? So you want to get to that same endpoint where you have a really solid data privacy program in place. Okay. I think where it's going to differ between startups and existing practices is more in the process.
Mm.
Okay. For startups, nothing or minimal things already in place, less time on the audit. There's no need to go through a bunch of different things because there's nothing in place. So that's probably the biggest key there. But what that leads to then is probably more time spent on the build, right? So they don't have anything in place. So they're going to need a bigger collection of artifacts, right? To be able to get this thing going. Right. For me, I think it's best if data privacy and security are considered prior to the IT setup.
Mhm.
So when they're doing all of this thing before they set up their networks and all of this kind of thing, have a privacy consultant look at that and help guide, right? Contracted IT is great and they have the technical know-how, but they don't often know the specific laws that govern what should be put in place. So I think that's where people like me can help.
Right.
But there's definitely an advantage of building things correctly from the beginning and avoiding rework. So I think this works great for startups, and it's pretty consistent for startups because there isn't a lot of variation in what's already in place. The process from startup to startup will be pretty consistent, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then on the other side, for the existing practices, we need to be much more thorough, conduct a very thorough audit to fully understand the risk, because as we discussed earlier, the audit determines the path forward. Each practice is going to have different things in place, and that will seriously affect what it looks like in the build phase. And then the train phase as well, because they're going to have a different collection of artifacts already in place and they won't. And so they'll only be needing to be trained on some, maybe. I think existing practices it'll be a little harder sell on some of the build because they've been doing things. It's worked for them.
That's
What do
always
we
the
don't?
that's always the hard sell. It's been
Right.
working, it's not broken. Why do we need to fix this?
I've never had a breach. I hope you never do.
Yeah.
There's no guarantees. And yeah, I think that's the harder piece there is I'm going to come in with certain recommendations and things, and how receptive are they to those changes, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that kind of gets me thinking. One is a little bit of a rabbit trail, so I'm gonna let you. Hopefully, you'll indulge me and let me go down it for just a
Okay.
second. But my second part, my first question is: I have docs all the time. I don't have a server in my office. I don't have to worry about these things because I'm just connecting up to the cloud to a whole nother company, and they're taking care of all of this for me. My first thought is that true, and is there still things that you need to be
Mhm.
concerned about, which I would think there are. But yeah, I think sometimes we can get a false sense of security thinking that I don't
Mhm.
have a server, so therefore I don't have anything to worry about. Can you just speak to that? I know that's a little bit
Sure.
of a rabbit trail there, but as I'm seeing more and more softwares, especially in our industry where they're all cloud based and
Mhm.
we aren't running servers in our office anymore. All of our computers are just hooking right up into something else. Do you mind speaking to that just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. There's some truth in that the requirements or the who's responsible for some of that stuff may be pushed off a little bit. All your stuff's in the cloud, and maybe who's ever managing that needs to be aware of these types of things. Also, the cloud-based software, the practice management software,
Yep.
things like that, where data is fully encapsulated within that system. And generally speaking, if a practice management system is good and they're doing what they should be for HIPAA, then they probably have a lot of those things in place, at
Mhm.
least for that data, right?
Mhm.
But what that doesn't cover is all this foundational stuff, right? It's the okay, maybe the security side of it, maybe you're better off than most. Maybe a lot of that's being handled, or maybe who's ever handling your servers or whatever, your cloud-based servers, maybe they don't know
Mhm.
what they're doing.
Mhm.
There's
Yeah.
always that too. But what I would say, it's all that foundational stuff, right? So it's all the documentation, it's the procedures, it's the plans, it's things that are the day to day, what happens in the office kind of a thing, right?
Sure.
It's what happens when a patient comes in and wants you to give them all of their medical records. What happens if they say, "Hey, show me who you're sharing my data with," right? What do we do there? What happens if you do have a data breach or if
Mm.
the cloud server company has a breach? You're still responsible for that. This is your patient data.
Yep.
And how do you handle that? So a lot of that stuff is the kind of stuff we try to dig into. But I would definitely say it's not completely true that just because you don't handle it or handle it on site doesn't mean you're exempt. So then the other piece of that is that's really only handling your PHI or your protected health information. So if you have a website or if you have, like we talked about earlier, contact forms and all this other data that could be collected, social media, all of this stuff, those are all means for things to go wrong, right? For data to be shared incorrectly or for you to be storing that data outside of your record, but that's not encrypted or that
Yeah.
data is it's in plain text, it's readable. Other things like staff making mistakes, right? They we don't have good policies in place where maybe they're downloading information out of their practice management system and storing it locally unprotected on their computer, right? Or they're taking that data, shooting it off to a consultant or shipped it.
Right.
All of that stuff I've seen, all of that stuff happens. Just because servers aren't on site or you're not actually controlling that doesn't mean that there's not risk and there's not things you need to be concerned about. I
Yeah.
guess that's where I would go.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for indulging me on that little rabbit trail there because I hear this all the time. And I think it's so important that it's so much bigger than just thinking about our operating systems and, oh, we're safe. It's,
Mhm.
you're really like painting a good picture for it, especially because we live in such a data forward
Mhm.
industry where we're out there on social, we're out there on our Google business page, and there is a lot of I think exposure that we probably don't think about or wouldn't even realize could be exposure. And just thinking that we definitely need companies like yourself in place to help us stay safe because I think a lot of times it's not if, it's when something
Sure.
is going to happen. So with that kind of in mind, I'm wondering if somebody's listening now and they're like, oh, okay, maybe I really need to take this seriously. Do you have any top suggestions or maybe your top 3 things that you're like, "Okay, this if I could give you 3 things that I think that you could address right away, what would those be?" Hey docs, let's talk about Smile Suite because it's not just another scheduling system. It's a game changer in the world of new patient management. And as a proud Smile Suite partner, I've witnessed the incredible impact it has on practices of all sizes. Smile Suite means your new patient calls and web leads are expertly handled 7 days a week, even during nights and weekends. And they offer top-notch customizable presentation software and seamless post-consultation follow-up. It's like having a secret weapon for your practice's success. Curious? Dive into the revolution at getsmilesuite.com. And don't forget to mention Hey Docs to unlock some extra goodies. Elevate your practice with Smile Suite because every smile deserves a suite of excellence. Are you ready to revolutionize your orthodontic practice and retainer program? Then I suggest you reach out to Retainers for Life. It's like Amazon for retainers, convenient and efficient. Having Retainers for Life in your practice means patients can easily order retainer replacements online with direct delivery to their mailbox. No more emergency appointments, waiting, or strain on your practice. It eliminates the hassle of managing retainers while adding a steady income stream and even equips you with marketing tools to boost your success. Ready to get started? Go to www.afterorthorevenue.com/heydocs.html and mention our code RFLHEYDOCX. That's REFLHEYDOCS to receive $2,000 off your onboarding fee. With Retainers for Life, you can say goodbye to retainer headaches and hello to effortless efficiency and extra revenue.
Okay. Let's start with the first thing. It's generic, but it's know your risk, right? And if you don't know where your shortcomings are or where the holes are, it's really hard to ensure that you're compliant or that you're properly protecting patient data. Suggestion is conduct the HIPAA risk assessment, right? And they can do that themselves. Obviously, I'm biased, and I would say that someone who does this for a living might get a deeper and a more thorough assessment. But there's nothing in the HIPAA law that says you can't do it yourself. Figure out where your holes are. And this is in privacy and security, all of those things, and just know that. And then, because even if you decide that you're not going to go forward immediately with the work, knowing the risk and understanding the path forward is super important. So that's the first thing. Just know what you're dealing with, know your risk.
Yeah.
The second thing is a little more specific, but I believe this to be a very widespread miss. Know who you're sharing patient data with. Okay. And I say that because I've had conversations with docs and I've had conversations with other consultants and trying to get to the bottom of, hey, what do you do when you guys hook up and share data? By law, practices are not allowed to share patient data with third parties, including consultants like myself, without a contract in place. And this isn't hey, I'm going to give you these services for this amount of money contract, right? This is the contract that kind of lays out other things like the data that's allowed to be shared, the permissible uses of that data, what to do if there's a breach, what to do with the data when the contract ends, right? So this contract is the responsibility of the practice. It's not the responsibility of the third party. So that doesn't mean the third party, if they've been doing it a while, is not going to come with a contract, and they'll just have the doctor sign it. That's possible and that's allowed, but the responsibility lies with the practice. So if for some reason there was a breach somewhere down the line, we've seen a few recently where there was a large breach, and once Health and Human Services come in and start taking a look, and they say, "Hey, who are you sharing data with, or who's sharing data with you?" And they give you the list of, "Hey, these are the practices that are selling." Then Health and Human Services can come to the practice and say, "Show me the authority that you had to share data with that." And I have a feeling that they'd be. Not everybody's doing that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to agree with you on that one.
And I think what's important also to know with this specific one is it doesn't matter whether the practice is sending data to the third party or whether they're allowing access to their systems that hold the patient data. So either way, it's considered data sharing. And anytime a business associate or third party has provided access to the patient data, one of those needs to be in place.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say, other than know your risk, know who you're sharing data with. And if you don't have contracts in place, get contracts in place.
Yeah. That's such good information. Yeah. Perfect. That's great.
And then really if I had a third one, it's a little more practical in that there's something you can do right away and it will help with a lot of issues that could arise. And that is make sure your staff is trained on phishing and secure data handling practices. Okay. So for those that don't know, phishing is where cyber attackers deceive people into revealing sensitive information. Could be user IDs, passwords. It could be the actual patient data, right? Could be anything. The majority of breaches happen because of an accident or mistake. I think I mentioned that earlier. Sharing data with people they shouldn't be sharing data with, sending data around via unencrypted emails, storing patient data in plain text, clicking on malicious links, falling for phishing attacks. All of those things open the door for very bad things to happen. If you're going to train somebody on something right away, phishing and secure data handling practices.
Yeah, I love that you say that. And I'm just going to tell you, and anybody who's listening, it is so easy. We've seen it in the Facebook groups, we see it all the time. It is so easy to fall prey to those because these guys are masters at their craft
Mhm.
at deception. And
Right.
I have just seen so many things, even within my own business, where I'll be like, that just doesn't look quite right. I know there's something not quite right. It takes a little bit to be like,
It
oh,
does.
the wrong word is capitalized or the wrong
Right.
something or another is,
Spelling is off, or it's very generic in their
yeah,
greeting to you, or things like that. That you just go, I don't know, that doesn't seem right. And they're getting more sophisticated too, right? It used to be strictly phone calls, and then it was emails, and now it's text messages. I'm not sure why you would ever answer something like that to a text message, but email's the biggest way they're doing it right now. And but those, like you mentioned, there are key things you can look at, and you can actually look at the URL or look at the sender and the URL and right click and actually inspect it. And you can see if it's not not coming from the legitimate place. So,
I love that you brought that up because I just think it's such a prevalent thing right now. And that just leads me into my next question. And you've answered this already, but how do we help our teams keeping them trained and being knowledgeable on all this information? Is this training that we should be doing once a quarter, once a
mhm,
year, every 6 months?
sure.
Pick it and stick it and you never have to think about it again.
It's not that. It's not that one.
If it were only that easy.
No, to me, the best thing a practice can do to get their staff better trained and knowledgeable in this area is to make data privacy a priority. Okay. And here's why I say that. So, doctors, make sure your teams know the data privacy is important to you, right?
Mm. Yes.
So if the boss isn't concerned about it, staff's not going to be concerned about it either, right? They're not going to take the time to become trained and knowledgeable on something they don't feel is important or that they don't feel is necessary for their job. And along with that, if you make it a priority and they can see and your staff can see that is important to you, further that along by bringing someone to train on a privacy or security topic on a regular basis. I would suggest quarterly,
Mhm.
or better yet, ask your privacy officer to pick topics and conduct the training themselves. There's tons of great resources out there to help. And it's a great growth opportunity, I think, for the privacy officer. It gets them more involved in the privacy program to begin with. Second, speaking of privacy and security officers, these are required by HIPAA, but most practices aren't big enough. They're not going to be bringing in specific privacy and security officers, right? They're going to assign it as a role to somebody else, right? Generally, that's to the practice manager, right? Practice managers are very busy and have a lot of responsibilities, so they may not have the necessary time to devote to data privacy. And I would say consider assigning these roles to someone at a lower level, you know, someone who may have an interest or who's hungry and who's looking for growth opportunities. There's nothing in HIPAA that says it has to be the practice manager. There's nothing that says it has to be anybody specific, right? So give it to somebody who's hungry, looking for growth. You know, they might be more invested in it, and I think you'll likely get better results.
Yeah, I love that.
And then the third thing, and this isn't healthcare related at all. This is something I tell all of my clients in retail, everything. I tell them that they need to stop thinking of protecting personal data or responding to data privacy requests as a burden, right? Think of it as like another product or service that you offer. For instance, orthodontists offer traditional braces, they offer clear aligners, right? But of equal importance, they offer privacy, they offer protection, and a simple, straightforward process for patients to exercise their data rights, right? I think just that little mind shift can have a huge impact on how the staff treats patient data and creates a willingness to want to learn and be more involved in the process. And then I think by that, they become more curious and want to learn more. And they're reaching out and they're trying to figure out, hey, what does this all mean? What is it? What can I best do to get myself knowledgeable and trained? So I think those are the three things that I would say.
Yeah. Ooh, I love all three of those points. Really good. And I think easy. And I especially love especially for our startup docs too. You may not have multiple people in your practice, but just
Mhm.
giving an opportunity for somebody to feel like they've got ownership over something.
Mhm.
And this is an easy thing. This is not that it doesn't need to be paid attention to, but somebody who maybe has a little bit more time and can follow the system to make sure that the practice stays safe. And I really appreciate
Yep.
what you said.
Yeah.
The teams will follow their doctors. Doctors, hear me on this. If it's important to you, your teams will make it valuable. If it's not important to you or you don't understand it, don't expect that your teams are going to understand it. And I see this especially in our startups where many times we're hiring people into our medical industry that have never been in our medical. They don't even maybe even know what HIPAA and some of these things are. They may know it as a consumer, but it was just that form that the doctor's
Yep.
office had me fill out. But they didn't really have any training on it. They don't really know. They just know it's a form I have to fill out in order to see the doctor. And so I think just taking the time, like we have to do in every area, as our battleship principles, where are we weak at? Where are we vulnerable at? If we just take the time and then teach our teams where what's important to us, they will follow. They will do exactly what we need them to do to help keep us safe.
They
And it
absolutely
isn't
will.
and it doesn't require you as doctors to be the superman or the superwoman of your practice. Lean on your team for that. I'm really curious if you can, I don't know, maybe talk about some of the common pitfalls that you see in regard to data privacy and practices, and what are some of those potential consequences if we aren't following good data and consumer privacy practices?
Sure. Yeah, I think if I could give one piece of advice, I would tell practices that it would benefit them to go beyond the basics. Okay. And what I mean by the basics is this is your notice of privacy practices. This is the acknowledgement from the patient that they've seen the notice of privacy
Mhm.
practices. This is keeping conversations private, right? That's what I would call the basics. These are all things that the patient will see, and they're definitely important. But those things alone don't necessarily meet HIPAA requirements. Okay.
Oh,
Majority of a strong data privacy program is what's going on behind the scenes. Okay. That's the foundational stuff that the patient doesn't see. That's the documentation and the processes and the procedures and the policies, security controls, those kind of things. These are equally important because this is also the stuff that's going to be examined heavily by Health and Human Services if there's a breach, right? Or they receive a complaint. Practices can show that they put effort in and that reasonable safeguards are in place, then that can reduce or eliminate fines altogether. And then you mentioned consequences. So obviously we know about some of these, right? These are fines. We talked about it earlier. These are if there is a breach remediation cost, there's damages to reputation, loss of patients, failure to attract new patients, right? All of those things can come out of this if the program isn't solid. And so I want to go over a scenario, right? So we call it the 500 record scenario. So let's just say a hacker or a disgruntled employee even gets access and steals 500 patient records. Okay. So current statistics show that breach remediation costs about $500 per record in healthcare. So 500 records, $500 a piece. It's about $250,000 to remediate. Okay. And that's not even 500 records is not even a large breach. And then in addition to that, there's the notification piece. So regardless of what size the breach is, right? Affected patients need to be notified. Health and Human Services needs to be notified. Depending on location, some states' attorney generals need to be notified. But the big one is at 500 records, local media outlets need to be notified. Okay. So it's going on the news, right? So obviously, this is a big concern for a reputation of a practice, right? So you just want to make sure that all of that stuff is in good shape because once they come looking, you can save money on things like fines and stuff like that. So, but also, it's about far more than just breaches. Other violations have significant impacts, things like failing to perform a risk analysis or denying patient access to their records or charging them high fees to do. There was a practice a few years back that was fined $10,000 or $12,000 because patients were asking for their records and they were trying to charge them something like $170 copying fee or something to do so. And so obviously
yeah.
that wasn't allowed, but things like failure to provide the required training, failure to enter into the business associate agreements. But that's really the big things, right? That's what I would have them do is
Great.
just make sure they're building out the foundation as well as the stuff that the patient may see.
Yeah. Oh, that's such good information. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. good. That was good. And so as we finish up here, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, this is such good information. You've just broken this down so easily for us. And I'm sure I've got a lot of docs that are like, Greg is going to be really easy to talk to. And he's not going to beat me up when I call him and tell him, I haven't
Definitely
done
not.
anything with this. The best way that they can reach out if they want to get some help or just maybe get a little additional information outside of what we've talked about
Sure.
today.
WaterPointeConsulting.com. That's WaterPoint with an E on the end of it. I made it really difficult. So WaterPointeConsulting.com. There's a contact form on there. Email me at gregd@WaterPointeConsulting.com. Or also on that website, you can find my phone number and I'm happy to take calls as well.
Perfect. That's awesome. Greg, as I like to finish up Hey Docs with a little speed round. Are you ready to jump into the speed round with me?
Oh, sure. Let's do it.
All right. What's your favorite go-to productivity tool?
Go to productivity tool. So I have a couple. The first I would say is Teams. So Microsoft Teams,
Mhm.
I use a lot. So for messaging and meetings. So that kind of keeps me connected. And then the other one I use is called Evernote, and
Oh, I
it's
love
it's
one.
a product for note taking and task management. Those are my go-tos right now.
Yeah, I love Evernote. Are you an early bird or a night owl?
No, it's not even a competition here. I'm an early bird. And the reason is I like to get things done first thing in the morning because
Mm.
the rest of the before the rest of the country's working. That way, if meetings take up a good portion of my normal day, then at least I got some work done.
Yeah, that's wonderful. How about your first job you ever had?
First job I ever had was as a pizza cook. I was 14 years old. My mom was a waitress at an Italian restaurant, so she got me the job. And we had a big picture window out front. I had my counter and I used to throw
Oh,
the
I
pizza dough and all
so
kinds of
you were
stuff.
the guy who
It,
everyone's
it, wa-
like,
it
"I
was
could
good
never
for a
do that."
14-year-old.
I bet. That's awesome. And what would you say has had the most impact on your professional life?
On my professional life, I'd say definitely military service. I chose that route over going to college out of high school. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I wasn't super interested in continuing on in school at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And so I chose the Air Force. My dad had been in the Air Force. And I think it really, for me, it was the best decision I could have made. It taught me discipline and responsibility and service, hard work, all those things that can definitely be used in my professional life.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for your service.
Oh, my
And
pleasure.
yeah, and then our last one, what is one business skill you think everybody should have?
Oh, there's a lot.
How to narrow it down.
I'm going to narrow it down and say critical thinking.
Mm,
And
good.
I think being able to form judgments based on analysis of facts and the things in front of you, I think is important no matter what line of work you go into. So
Yeah. Yeah. Greg, this has been just a delight. Thank you so much for taking a really scary, not so sexy thing that we have to deal with in and out of our businesses and making it just really easy to digest. And I think you gave us some really good implementable things that we can move forward with right away. So thank you.
absolutely. I hope it helped the audience out there. And again, I appreciate you having me on. I had a good time.
Yep. Thank you. All right. Till next time.
All right. Bye.